Hello, and thank you for joining us on The Brink. I'm Jake Wallis Simons.
And I'm Andrew Fox, and this is our first episode. So today we're going to be talking about the current affairs that have happened this week. We're going to look at Tommy Robinson March last weekend and the genocide report issued by the UN yesterday. But first we're going to talk a little bit about what to expect from The Brink going forward. So Jake, do you want to tell us where you got this idea from that we should do this together?
Yeah, well, I came up with the idea for this podcast when I was writing my book, which I have a copy of which I happen to have here, which I'm giving to you actually, Andrew. So there you are. That's for you.
I can model this for the camera.
So it's never again ? How the West betrayed the Jews in itself. It's coming out on the 2nd of October in a couple of weeks' time. So I was thinking about that, and I was interviewing some people for the podcast, for the book, Douglas Murray, Tom Holland, the historian, not the Spider-Man, Ed Hussein, Bernard Henri Levy, Barry Weiss we interviewed, and some others. And I thought that it would be interesting for readers of the book to be able to listen to the entire interview separately to what I quote in the book. And so then I thought, well, it would be nice to do that as a podcast. And then I thought it would be cool to get you involved because we have a similar outlook on the world, but also dovetailing experience, I think, with me as my background as a foreign reporter and you with your military background. So that's how The Brink was born.
And here it is. It's come to life.
Let's talk about what this podcast is, what it's going to be, and what it's not. What is this podcast not, Andrew?
Well, what we're not is centrist dads.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's the phrase that I know you've spoken about a lot in your book, which is where this podcast comes from.
Yeah.
We're not trying to find a happy middle ground where we, bring the boundaries of conversation in and limit what people can say and limit how people think. What we're trying to do is find a centre-right, patriotic solution to the problems that are confronting our society.
Yeah, we're trying to be sane and sensible and sound is what we're trying to do.
The three S's.
And of course, in describing this podcast to people, the easiest way I found to describe what we are is by saying we're not Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, and we'll get to that. But also, we're not Piers Morgan, are we?
No, I'm definitely not.
Neither of us are Piers Morgan.
No, I've never invented atrocities about British soldiers in Iraq, so it doesn't work for me.
But also, Piers Morgan, he's very, he's a very talented journalist. I've met him a few times. I'm not saying he's a bad person necessarily, but it feels to me as if there's something that happens when you go very digital and you chase clicks, that the guests you invite on are more and more outrageous. The conversations you have are more and more inflamed.
You're looking for those viral moments.
You're looking for the viral moments, and what you lose is good sense, and you lose anything constructive and real and sound and balanced. And we are definitely not going to go there. This is going to be proper stuff.
Yeah, exactly. We're not this kind of centrist dads.
Yeah.
What would you call it? The kind of the dictatorship of these views that kind of, I think, make everything worse. But by taking no position or that left-wing position on everything, you end up literally recommending the worst possible things in the world. I mean, look at interviewing al-Sharaa, for example. From Syria, and it turns out he's an absolute monster. Who knew? Yeah,
exactly. So you're alluding to the rest is politics. And in the past few weeks, I've been telling people that we're doing this podcast. The easiest way to describe what we're trying to do is when people say to me, "What are you?" And I say, "Well, we're not Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell." And everyone goes, "Oh," well, their two reactions are, "Oh, that's great," and then "Thank God for that." I'm going to tune in because I think people are sick of that, really. I mean, they've got a lot of listeners from a certain particular demographic, but I think that centrist dad thing has really run its course, and it's a big part of the reason for the whole catastrophe that we're in. The Guardian described, I actually wrote it down, The Guardian described the centrist dad podcast trend as two sensible Remainer men who wish they were still in charge. Now, we might be sensible perhaps, but we're not Remainer men, and we certainly don't wish we were in charge at all, let alone still in charge. And there's a bit in my book where I talk about Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, but particularly Rory Stewart. last year, I listened to an episode of Rory being interviewed by Sam Harris on his podcast, Making Sense. And Sam Harris, he's quite skeptical of Islam, particularly radical Islam. And he was pressing Rory Stewart on the connection between Islam and suicide bombing, just trying to get him to explore why there's this phenomenon of jihadism and particularly of suicide bombing emerging from Islam, which hasn't always been that way. For the first, 1,000 years or 1,400 years of its history wasn't like that. And he refused to accept that there was a link between, suicide bombing and Islam. And he kept deflecting it. He said things like, they're not alone in young men getting het up and wanting to take action. At one point, he said about Afghanistan, I noted this down as well, I think people don't like foreigners trying to boss them around, and they'll reach for religion when it suits them, as if suicide bombing is somehow excused because you're resisting occupation. And he even compared his own backstory of leaving Oxford and going out as part of the occupation of Iraq to govern a province, his seeking adventure, to young men and women actually leaving towns in England and going off to fight for Islamic State, like Jihadi John did. He said it's the spirit of adventurism and that sort of thing. So he did his best to deny that link. And in fact, the only time he was actually able to muster some criticism of anybody was when he talked about the Americans and their presence in Afghanistan. He said, I don't think you've got the patience to really nurture a culture and bring them on. You just want to tell people what to do, to be there for the decades necessary to put the hard work in. And the fact that the Americans were in Afghanistan for decades didn't seem to bother him. But it was really, I think that that's really dangerous because, as I mentioned in the book, it just made me think of the Manchester Arena bombing. And I happened to be, although I was doing foreign reporting at the time, I happened to be doing a story down the road from Manchester when that bomb went off. And I remember hearing it on the news. And initially it said it was a gas explosion. But I knew something was up and I went straight down there. So I was one of the first people there and it was really quite horrible.
Yeah, of course.
Having covered a lot of terror attacks, that one being so people were still searching for survivors and all the rest of it. And in the inquest, there was this one moment where the security guard, Kyle Lawler, who was on duty at the Manchester Arena, recalled, a young guy, recalled seeing Salman Abedi coming in with his backpack that he could barely carry. And his suspicions were aroused. But he thought to himself, no, don't be Islamophobic. Because he had internalized the idea that making a connection between suicide bombing and somebody who was clearly Muslim or looked likely Muslim was Islamophobic and wrong. And I'm not saying that Kyle Lawler listened to Rory Stewart and was directly influenced. And I'm not saying that Rory Stewart has got bad intentions necessarily. But this sort of instinct to which I describe in the book as centrist fundamentalism. The centrist dad thing, the fundamentalism being that you deride anybody who disagrees with you. You mock anyone who wants to fly the flag, the British flag. I think there's been so damaging in our culture because it's made us doubt ourselves and doubt our own instincts and lose our sense of self. And I think that's responsible for a lot of the catastrophe that we're in today.
Yeah, and it comes from a place of control, doesn't it? You control what people say and you control what they think. And that's why these free speech crackdowns are so dangerous, because they cut off those neural pathways that allow you to label things. And sometimes there is a need to label the problem facing you. And, defining the problem is always the start of finding a solution.
Yeah.
And unless you can define it properly, then you'll never find the solution. And clearly, jihadism is a fact. Particularly Wahhabi and that extreme nature of it. And the Saudis admit it's a problem and have dealt with it. The UAE admit it's a problem and have dealt with it. And yet we are, even now currently looking at legislation in Parliament to define Islamophobia as a crime and limit what we can say and thereby react to the problem. So
that's what,
this is critical.
Before that law comes in, we're straying off script already.
We are, yes.
But before that law comes in, can you speak a bit about your personal encounters with jihadism when you were in the forces?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I did 3 tours in Afghanistan. So, the first 4 years of my army career between 2007 and 2010 were spent fighting radical Islam. And it was an interesting nihilism. We saw suicide bombers. Luckily I didn't, but certainly I've got friends in Tupara who were very badly injured by a suicide bombing, and we lost a couple of soldiers in that incident as well. And you would fight the Taliban, and it was really interesting to see how they parked their objections when it suited them as well. So there's a real inherent hypocrisy here. So I remember
who parked the objections?
The Taliban did. So we saw them, and we had a firefight with them on the steps of a mosque. We were passing by the mosque, and they opened fire, and they didn't mind hitting the mosque with their bullets. Obviously, ours were firing away from the mosque, back towards the Taliban, but it didn't concern them in the slightest. So, it wasn't just radical Islam. It was, an international campaign to try and destabilize the new government that we tried to bring in Kabul. Pakistan were deeply involved, China, Iran, they all had fingers in the pie of the Taliban. And we also see, I think, what happens when you go to war without a real plan. Because we spent 20 years, billions of dollars, thousands of lives to replace the Taliban with a worse version of the Taliban. So, not a particularly successful campaign, but it shows how difficult it is to combat these problems and these mindsets.
And when you were on the ground there in Afghanistan, did you mainly shoot at people? Did you actually engage with people and get behind the ideology, where they're coming from in terms of the other side, the enemy?
Yeah, we tried to engage with the people all the time.
Yeah.
It was very much a counterinsurgency campaign. Yeah. The people were what we called the center of gravity. We were trying to persuade them that the best option for their future was to have a semi-democratic government in Kabul that could hopefully bring economic development and prosperity for everyone. Obviously, that was a huge pipe dream and potentially unattainable, but we certainly interacted with the locals.
But I meant more the enemy, like the Taliban. Did you have they called a shura?
So shuras they're
like meetings
with leaders on the ground. So where we were, you never really knew if the guy you were speaking to was Taliban sympathetic or not. Some of them were kind of ethno-nationalists in some ways. Their loyalties are to family, tribe, then probably Islam, and then only then kind of Afghanistan as a concept if they can make some money out of it. And where those views came into conflict, they would always go with their own. And so they saw themselves as Pashtuns down in Helmand. Pashtunistan is an area that crosses the Pakistan border. So they don't recognize that international border on the ground. And yeah, so some of them were Taliban, some of them were nationalists. None of them liked us.
Yeah.
But we tried to interact.
And I mean, I think for a lot of people, Afghanistan already feels like a long time ago. We've almost forgotten about it as a culture. In fact, certain American figures have forgotten about it entirely and our contribution to it, which will draw a veil over that. But for the last couple of years, certainly since 7th of October, you've been fighting in a different way. In the info wars, trying to bring some sense of sanity and fact-based analysis to the war between Israel and Hamas. What led to your passion for doing that?
So after Kabul fell in 21, I was part of a team of people who were helping Afghans escape to safety, who'd been our former allies. Lots of female prosecutors. They were very high on the hit list. Intelligence officers, special forces from the Afghan army. But we managed to get 3,000 people out, mostly women and children. But we couldn't have done that without the Jewish community in the UK, who gave us the financial support we needed, the structures we needed to operate as a charity, and the legal advice we needed so that we weren't accidentally people trafficking.
So was this when you were serving?
No, this was just after I'd left the army. So literally months after I'd left. We had the big Operation Pitting, Kabul airport and all that craziness.
So you were taking part you working for an NGO, or?
No, I was doing it from my sofa in Surrey.
Okay.
I was running a safe house ring in Kabul with my fixer, a black market passport ring. I was getting visas to Pakistan. I was liaising with our civil service in Islamabad.
And that was just to get the people that you cared about out the country.
Yeah, including guys like Sher, who was a former student of mine at Sandhurst. I trained him. Yeah. And people never stopped being your blokes. When you're an army officer, you always kind of have that connection, and I wanted to make sure he was safe with his wife and 6 kids under 10. But yeah, the Jewish community helped us do that because, and one of them said to me, we remember what it's like to be persecuted, which I thought was very powerful. And then, of course, my master's degree is in Middle Eastern strategy. I'm in a lot of Telegram groups and various information sources for my ongoing research. And 7th of October happened and I had it pretty much live streamed.
Right.
I was getting the Hamas stuff pretty much as they were pushing it out on some of those groups. And I was in Germany for an Indianapolis Colts game.
Okay. Okay. Indianapolis Colts, for people who might not know what
they are,
Colts
an American football team.
Right.
My family comes from Indiana, so I'm a big Colts fan. But
it's like rugby with helmets, basically.
Yes, pretty much. Yeah. And a lot more money. But yeah, these videos of 7th of October coming over my phone, and then I turn on the news and I see people in London on the streets celebrating these horrors that I've just watched.
And that was personal for you, wasn't it, from your time serving in the forces as well?
Of course, you know, I had a good Jewish friend who died, Paul. I had other Jewish friends that I served with. So, you know, the idea that, you know, the celebrations of the deaths of Jews, when I knew Jews who were serving our country nobly and who had died in doing so, was particularly jarring. And it was a juxtaposition, I think, between the horrors I'd been watching on my phone, you know, unfiltered, nothing grayed out, nothing blurred. And then people are celebrating it. Yeah. And I also spoke to my Jewish friends, and the pain of 7th of October was massively amplified, I think, by the reaction to it in London when people were celebrating. So that was very powerfully motivating. I had a small platform. I was in a TV documentary, so I had a few thousand followers on X. And if people want to go on YouTube and look up The Paras Men of War, episode 3, you can see me when I was still cool.
Well, with this podcast, you're going to become even cooler than you've ever been before, Andrew. But it's funny because, I mean, we're coming up to the anniversary of the 7th of October, and it's, you know, almost 2 years ago, and it feels like so much longer than that. Because, I mean, you know, I'm not wanting to make it all about me, but it changed my life as well as it changed yours and everyone. I mean, it changed the world, it changed everyone's lives. But it's interesting that, you know, you talk about seeing that footage. And at the time I was editor of the Jewish Chronicle, the world's oldest Jewish paper. And when I'd taken the job, Israel was quite stable. Yeah, I wrote a book, Israelophobia, which came out on the 7th of September, which made arguments that looking back were both almost prophetic, but also naive, because, you know, although I mapped out the kind of the dry riverbeds that the torrent of anti-Semitism was about to flow through, it was, at that time, it wasn't yet a torrent. It felt bad then, but after 7th of October, you know, it magnified many, many times. And so I think I was exposed to the same sorts of stuff that you were, because people were sending it to me from Israel and so on. And it really was a moment of a pivotal moment for the world and for us personally. And it's funny how, obviously I wasn't in the forces, but as a foreign reporter before, had touch points of experience that were parallel to yours in a different way.
Because you went to the Bataclan during that massacre, didn't you?
Yeah.
I mean, just afterwards, rather.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was, in my career, I began writing for the Times, worked for the BBC a bit, radio.
No badge of shame or, you know.
Well, no, I'm proud of the work that I did. It was good. I mean, I was on From Our Own Correspondent a lot. I've always focused on foreign reporting, basically, and I worked for the Telegraph. But when I was actually sent out to be properly on the road was 2015, when I began to work for the Mail. And I became what's known on Fleet Street as a fireman, which means that you're based in the UK waiting for a fire to start overseas. And as soon as it does, you're sent out. So I'd wake up on a Monday morning without knowing where I would be by the end of the day or for how long. And the deal was that I wasn't really asked to do anything while I was in Britain, so long as whatever happened at any time, I would go. That was the deal. And so the first story was in Israel, on the border between Israel and Syria during the Syrian civil war, when the IDF was providing medical aid to injured Syrians on the other side of the fence, bringing them in, including even al-Nusra jihadis. I interviewed a couple of them, and they weren't quite as benign as they initially appeared. or as they made out, they said, oh, publicly, thank you very much, I don't hate Jews anymore. But then as soon as the cameras were off, they said, I still do hate Jews, actually. I still want to kill them. But the second story I did was the Bataclan attacks. And I was there really early on because I flew from a small airport that had earlier flights rather than from London. So I got there. I guess you could measure it by the size of the shrines outside the various cafes. When I got there was a few flowers, but within a few hours there was a sea of flowers. And spent time on the ground there. And after that, spent the next few years covering all the terror attacks on the ground pretty much in Europe. There was Paris, Stockholm, Berlin, Nice, Istanbul. I covered the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka, but also covering the migrant crisis as well, which was big at the time.
And you actually went with some migrants, didn't you?
Yeah, so I was. There was one story in particular when there was this camp called Idomeni on the border of Greece and Macedonia. At the time, migrants were trying to get into Greece in order to make get in from Greece into Macedonia in order to make their way into Northern Europe. And this camp was being described in the press as Dachau, as a concentration camp. I went there. I don't think there were NGOs handing out free medical care and food in Dachau. So it was at the time, there was that sense of propaganda that hadn't found the focus of Israel just yet.
Yeah.
But it was still there. And the story was that there were some migrants who had been trying to get into Macedonia across the border illegally by night and were fording, or I think by day actually, by daylight, and were fording rivers, and some of them had been washed away and drowned. So I was asked to go and find them and go with them, basically, which I tried to do. Went to Idomeni, found a petrol station down the road where the people smugglers were meeting. That was like the local place. Went there, met a couple of migrants who I fell in with and quite liked. There was one chap in particular called, actually I've called him Imran in the book. That wasn't his real name, but he was from Pakistan, from Lahore, peaceful country, no war. His father was an ISI officer, Pakistani intelligence officer, so obviously well connected. That means a lot in Pakistan. It means that you're from the elites. But he'd had an argument with his father, and in his words, I always remember this, he decided to become a refugee after that. So then made his way to. I met him in Greece. He and his mate had tried, I think, 4 or 5 times to cross into Macedonia. Each time the police had caught them, arrested them, dumped them back into Greece again. And his friend actually was crying. There was no reason for them to make it into Europe. They were safe in Pakistan, and yet they were desperate to. They were really motivated to, and they were sacrificing all, their own well-being to do that. And these guys were absolute shysters. And I was offended by what they were doing because they were making life so much more difficult for the genuine Syrian refugees that were suffering. And yet I quite liked them as well. And, I got to know them and we hung out and we tried to break across the border. And then halfway through, in the middle of the night, one of the people smugglers saw a white face and saw who I was, and we had this row and it all got chaotic, and I was kicked out before the police could get hold of me, basically. But yeah, I mean, I'm rambling, but
but that shaped your worldview, and
experiences like that, I think, like you, we both sort of lived the news in different ways and had experiences that when you talk about jihadis, what you're talking about. When I talk about migrants, I've had that experience with them. I know that they're human beings and I know who they are to some extent. And I think that is going to come through a lot in our podcasts and distinguish us from the centrist ad podcasters, of which there are many out there.
Yeah, and it's a matter of trying to harness that experience and apply it to modern world current affairs. And, Israel is the perfect example of that.
So let's talk about, so we're going to talk a lot about Israel because that's what we believe in and have been fighting for, but not only about Israel.
Of course not. This is fundamentally a British problem right now, but it's also a European problem. Yeah. It's an American problem in many ways. Obviously, the problem set is slightly different across the Atlantic. But it's certainly a problem that faces the West. And as your book title says, it's about how the betrayal of the Jews is the first step in a much larger betrayal and a much larger problem. And that's that multifaceted problem. The facets of that are what we want to attack. Yeah. And hopefully we'll have these guests who we've got a pretty incredible slate lined up.
Let's talk about the guests.
Yeah, so the people you've interviewed for your book, fantastic. Douglas Murray, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Niall Ferguson.
Neil Ferguson.
Neil Ferguson, my apologies. Yeah, all in the can. All good to go. So they'll be released over the next few weeks. And of course, our first interview together was Barry Weiss.
Yeah.
Which I'm really looking forward to seeing the end result of that, because she was sharp as a knife, wasn't she?
She was brilliant.
Really impressive.
Yeah. And that line that she came out with, that I actually cited in that speech that I gave at the anti-Semitism rally a couple of weeks ago, where she said that we're not facing a crisis of trust in politics, we're facing a crisis of trustworthiness in politics, was so brilliant. And it's really been ringing in my ears ever since.
Yeah, that's a line for the ages.
It is.
And, hopefully that trustworthiness is something that we aspire to here as well.
And in fact, the chat that I had with Ed Hussein, who obviously is a former extremist in his youth, who then was converted out of extremism by his father, who is a more traditional Muslim in the Sufi tradition, not an extremist. So it's interesting. He wasn't converted out by secularism or by mainstream society, by his father, from a Muslim point of view. The conversation I had with him was one of my favorites, because I found that he and I agreed on so much. It's rare that you meet somebody, apart from yourself, of course, that you agree with so much on. And he's a disciple of Sir Roger Scruton. He did his PhD with Sir Roger as his supervisor. Has a deep faith in Islam, but by no means extreme. He left that behind many, many years ago. And it was so fascinating. And I think that, in fact, that sort of brings us on to the Tommy Robinson March. We're going to talk about that a little bit on the weekend. What were your feelings about that?
I think it
wasn't 3 million people. It was,
it was between
100,000, wasn't it? Something
110,000 up to potentially 250,000. Still a good turnout.
Yeah.
Still a good turnout. Yeah. Far more than the Palestine rallies, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
Who all march and rally organisers in London seem to use the Hamas Ministry of Health for their totals. They're always vastly exaggerated, but it's still a good number. And I think in many ways it provided the mirror image of the Palestinian marches, because not everyone on a Palestinian march is anti-Semitic. But if you go on a march that's organised by anti-Semites, where they have anti-Semitic speakers and people in the crowd are being anti-Semitic, then you're on an anti-Semitic march. By the same token, if you go on a march, no matter how well-intentioned, organised by someone who is of the far right, with far right speakers saying some quite outrageous things on stage, actually, I thought, and there are undeniably further right people in the crowd, then you're probably on a far right march. And that's not to say that a lot of these people weren't patriotic and they aren't deeply upset by some of the problems they see in the country. But I don't think Tommy Robinson is the answer.
No, I mean, broadly I agree, but I can't help but feel that, there are a lot of good people on that march.
Absolutely.
There are a lot of Union flags. There are a lot of George crosses, and those are good things. Those are good things to see. And there are thousands upon thousands of people who are just ordinary, decent people who've the worst thing they've done in their life has been born working class, basically, from the point of view of the liberal elites. These are the people who have been sneered at and derided and downtrodden.
Remember the Emily Thornberry tweet about the St. George Cross flag?
2014, in my book as well, actually, as it happened.
It's been going on a long time.
Yeah, they've been, those are the people who form the backbone of the army. We need them to fight for our country and defend us. And yet all the rest of the time, the liberal elites just deride them, scoff at them, demean them, because they articulate exactly what I was saying in my book. They articulate values which the elites, the centrist fundamentalists, have decided we're no longer allowed to have. Values that every other country in the world is allowed to have, that have been part of human experience since the dawn of history. Pride in your country, love of your country, wanting borders, respecting your history, all of those things. Not to say that we don't welcome outsiders. Of course we welcome outsiders. You know what? I'm not talking about that. But these are good people. And I felt that very strongly.
Yeah, and it was a really interesting juxtaposition, because in the last month I've been in Ukraine, I've been in Gaza, and I've been in the USA.
Yeah.
And in all three of those countries, you see American flags, Ukrainian flags, Israeli flags everywhere.
Yeah.
And it really struck me, actually, that you so seldom see that in the UK. It's been so crushed down. I've seen Palestinian flags in the UK more in the last 2 years than I have UK flags.
Yeah. And in fact, after the Ukraine war began, there was that moment when everyone started flying the Ukrainian flag. And I felt that was almost like a sublimated patriotism, that we weren't fully able to fly our own flag with that much pride, but now we could fly the Ukrainian flag and get that instinct indulged a little bit. And I think that what it's led to with this backlash of people flying English flags and so forth is almost, it's something that's, it's on the one hand, it's good. We need to start flying our flag more. On the other hand, there's a sense of sectarianism about it, that, districts of our country that are heavily Muslim or heavily liberal are going to fly the Palestinian flag. And then areas that are not are going to fly the English flag. And it becomes a tribal thing, which isn't British.
No, it's not
British
at all. And you see this in Northern Ireland all the time, which is obviously the absolute template for sectarianism.
Yeah.
If you go somewhere like Londonderry, on the west side of the river, it's all Palestine flags. And because they fly Palestine flags, on the east side of the river, it's all Israel Trump flags.
Yeah.
I don't think either side has a particular understanding of the complexities of that particular war in the Middle East, or could even, articulate the history of it. But it's that instinctive antagonism, which I think is so dangerous.
Yeah, and it gets to the heart of what I'm trying to do with my book and what we're trying to explore in the podcast is, how do we restore our pride in the flag in a British way, in a reasonable way, that isn't sectarian, that isn't extremist or radical or chauvinist, that's just patriotic. It's how do we get back that instinct that we should never have lost, or should never have been taken from us, should never have been repressed by the elites in the first place. But now that it has been repressed for so long, how do we remember what it's like to have that healthy, natural patriotism without straying into radicalism?
Yeah, without it being hijacked by demagogues. And that's the danger. And you see, I think we see that across the Atlantic, where kind of fear and worry are hijacked. It's for people who are pushing a very strong agenda that I don't think is helpful. Yeah. And, that's my concern about last weekend, as you see Katie Hopkins and Lawrence Fox and Tommy Robinson. And, these are not the people that are going to lead us out of this situation. Yeah.
And I mean, I watched some of the rally online, and I felt quite sad. I felt inspired by looking at all those people who just want their country back, to use that phrase, overused phrase. But I felt dismayed by some of the speeches and the tone from the stage, because like you say, there was the kind of the thuggery of Tommy Robinson, fine, we know about that, but there was also this quite strange form of Christianity that really wasn't very British. There was a lot of American inspired preaching going on, and it reminded me again. Sorry, my book's fresh in my mind, so I don't want to keep talking about it, but there's stuff in there about American Christianity and how it's becoming increasingly radicalized by movements which are sort of Pentecostalism on steroids. There's this new, something called I wrote some notes here, New Apostolic Reformation movement, which by some measures accounts for about 40% of American Christians. I don't know if that's true. That could be exaggerated. But Tucker Carlson speaks from that hymn book, so to speak. Tucker Carlson, the American, unhinged, in my view, TV personality, former TV personality, now YouTube star, who claims to have been mauled by a demon in his sleep and have woken up with scratches along his back. These people, they spend a lot of the time doing battle with demons. They think that they go to a city and they demon map it. This demon is in charge of that bit. That demon's in charge of that bit. We've got to fight them through our prayer, speaking in tongues, whatever it is. We're the soldiers of Christ doing battle with evil. But they also have something called Seven Mountain Theology, or 7M it's abbreviated to, where they want to take over, in the name of Jesus, 7 aspects of society, which are media, the government, education, economy, family, religion, and the arts. So they want to turn a secular state into more of a theocratic one, or rather, maybe that's an exaggeration, but they want to bring Christianity into how the secular state has been organized and structured. And these things are certainly not British, let's put it that way. And some of the stuff that we saw coming from the stage wasn't. And it reminded me of one of the episodes that we've got coming up, where I interviewed Tom Holland, the historian, who wrote Dominion and talked a lot about Christianity and its influence. Well, that's what the whole book is about, and its influence on society today. And there's this bit at the end to go back to the migrant wave of 2015 and Angela Merkel's open door policy to migrants that she had at the time. Wir schaffen das, we can do this. So at that time, again, I was there on the ground seeing all this unfold. And with all these thousands upon thousands of people from numerous countries, unidentified, mainly men, streaming towards Germany, her reaction was, let's open the door, let them in, we can do it. And according to Tom Holland, he said in the podcast and in the book, and I think he's right, it came from her Christian faith. She was brought up as a devout Christian. And in her mind, the model of the good Christian was the Good Samaritan, where you care for the poor and the weak, and you uplift them, and you're charitable to them in the model of how Jesus was. But then he set it against the Christianity that was prevalent in Hungary and still is, the Viktor Orban Christianity, which is more, I suppose, a crusader model that, we've been fighting the Saracen, fighting the Muslims for hundreds of years. Hungary's got its own particular history of that. Yeah. We know what these guys are. We're not going to let them into our country and invade. Soldiers of Christ kind of approach. And these two different models of Christianity, what I said to Tom Holland at the time was, okay, which one do you think is the more genuine version of Christianity? And he said that he sided, if he had to, with Merkel's vision of the Good Samaritan. So I said, well, okay, if you're going to be running a country on those principles, how can you possibly have any sensible immigration policy at all? And his response was something like, that's why I don't think you can run a country on Christian principles, which was interesting. But I think, bringing it back to Tommy Robinson, from the stage, you saw a lot of the crusader type Christianity. We're against Islam, we're against the invaders. You didn't see any compassion, so far as I could see. There was no sort of openness to people who aren't like us, but who do have a place here because they are British and they are decent.
Yeah, and look, you've got a vortex in, I think, British religious life, certainly British Christian religious life, because the Church of England has completely disappeared in almost every respect. People don't go to church, and even when they do, they're bombarded with kind of a DEI version of Christianity. That doesn't actually mean anything to anyone. It reduces the teachings of the Gospels to nothing more than we should be nice.
And you're a Catholic.
I am Catholic, yeah. So, I do inflexibly recoil at Protestantism, clearly. But
you Papists.
Yeah, absolutely. That's horrible left-footers. But, I don't recognise much of the teaching, certainly from my church, when I hear those evangelical pastors going off. It seems to me that they take the Bible and just interpret it however they want. And that, interestingly, is what got Islam to jihadism, because it was the writings of certain scholars who took it in that direction, because they didn't have an equivalent of a pope. So the pope says, this is what it means. There you go. No questions. And it gives you a sort of single point of truth. Whereas when you don't have that kind of version control, if you will, people can pick up these words, interpret them however they want, and it feels equally valid to their followers. So you get those distortions, and that's exactly how we got to the point of this kind of Salafi extremist version of Islam. So it's a dangerous pattern, I think. Not that I'm saying they're all going to end up as suicide bombers.
No.
But it is a way that religion gets twisted and misused.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a whole other discussion, which maybe we don't have enough time for a future episode. We can talk about how Islam was warped and became jihadism. It's got a lot to do with the history of the Muslim empire collapsing in the face of Christendom, and then the rise of fascism and Hitler, and the cross-fertilization between extremist Islam and Hitlerism. But maybe that's for another week. But just to focus a little bit more on Christianity, it's interesting, isn't it, that that Christianity is in decline in Britain and in Europe overall. A couple of stats. So church membership in 1930 was 30%. Now it's 8% today. That's a steep decline. And by comparison to the Americans, in America it's declining as well. But in America, 90% of people believe in either God or a higher power of some sort. In Britain, that's 28%. So there's a big difference in our culture and attitudes. And yet recently there has been an increase within the overall decline. There's been an increase in the past 2-3 years in religious interest and observance, particularly among young Britons. But that has been directed towards mainly Catholicism and other non-establishment forms of Christianity, rather than the Church of England, to the extent that on current projections, it may be within the next 5 years that Britain could be more a Catholic country than a Church of England country for the first time since the Reformation. And it's interesting that people are attracted to that more red meat, or not red meat, but less diluted, less DEI version of Christianity.
Yeah, and
that's what they need.
And it is. It's that very clear structure, and that's a wonderful stat that we're making a comeback. We're taking it back.
You are.
We're taking it back.
You are. Yeah, you are. Yeah. Doesn't mean people burnt at the stake anytime soon, but
yeah. I know we're not going down that. But yeah, I mean, if we're going to look at Christianity in decline or in increase, it does irrevocably bring the Jews into the conversation, though, doesn't it? Because it's the Judeo-Christian principles that build on those 1,000 years of history that underpin everything that we've put together in this country. And so I think in many ways, if you get exposed to Christianity later in life, you will instinctively see parallels with how our country runs, the way people think in our country, because they're inevitably influenced by the way our culture, government, arts, you name it, have been shaped by Christianity in the past. I think it will naturally bring people back when they're exposed to it, because they'll recognize it was something they're familiar with, and that's a powerful kind of motivator. I think it puts structure and sense around ideas that they may not have been able to articulate.
Exactly, and I think that, I mean, once again, it's that same pattern that what we need, we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Not we, but the centrist fundamentalist elites, particularly since the Cold War, perhaps since the Second World War, in the name of never again, in the name of stopping fascism from coming back.
Yeah, fascism was created by states, therefore states are a bad thing, therefore let's break down the things that make them states. It's a pretty clear pattern, isn't it?
Exactly right. And the contrast with Israel is interesting because, the lesson that Jews took from the Holocaust is that a nation state is indispensable. And national pride is indispensable, and defense is indispensable. But the lesson that the West broadly increasingly took over the years is that nation states are bad and they need to be done away with. Borders need to be done away with. National pride needs to be done away with. And so you have this divergence in culture of two parts of the West, the Judeo part of our heritage in form of Israel, and the Christian part, I suppose, in the form of Britain, or dilute Christian, whatever it's become, that. And I think that tension is interesting. And I wonder whether part of the anti-Semitism that we see in Britain comes from the fact that for decades, the centrist fundamentalist elites have been trying to tamp down our sense of ourselves, our pride and our history, our pride in our flag and so on. But the Jews, as exemplified in Israel, have not gone through that process. And so they exist as a rebuke to the elites, because they have got still are embodying those old values that have become taboo, that in a way that we saw on the weekend, many of, not from the stage, but many of the people there still have that love of people and love of pride. And so in a way that's a rebuke to them. So anti-Semitism is woven into it's about our own neuroses here in the West, rather than about the Jews or Israel.
Yeah, I think it parallels the psychological scream that came from that group when the Brexit vote came in.
Yeah.
That was certainly the stiffest rebuke I can think of to that worldview that we should be governed by things that sit above states. And of course, we're seeing the weaponization of a lot of that right now with look at how the UN has behaved over Israel.
Yeah.
That is the supernatural body. It's the model on which all others wish they could copy. And yet that muscular patriotism that you see in Israel is a direct rebuke to that. Obviously there's other issues with the number of dictatorships, the number of Arab Muslim countries that sit in the UN. It's always going to have a majority against Israel.
Yeah.
And no wonder they employ all these activists to write these hideously skewed reports.
Well, let's talk about the genocide report then, because it's something you've looked at in detail.
Yeah, I had a good scrub through it yesterday, and then I had to have a bath. It's really not pleasant. It's essentially describing a war.
So this is the UN report
genocide
that accuses Israel of genocide. That's
from the Human Rights Council.
Yeah.
They've had a board of inquiry, I think they call it, and they've decided that Israel is fulfilling four of the characteristics of the Genocide Convention, and they've definitely identified intent to do so. And it's ludicrous. They've done the same thing that South Africa did in the ICJ. They've taken cherry-picked lines from speeches, completely devoid of context, and they've presented them as something they're not. Amalek is the big one. And bearing in mind, of course, Amalek is written in The Hague on the wall on the monument there.
So for people who might not know what Amalek is,
go on. I'll let the Jewish gentleman explain that.
Reaching back into my biblical education as a child, Amalek was basically a tribe that's identified in the Bible as being very evil and will always be an enemy of the Jews, and so therefore they have to be wiped out wherever you find them. That's in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and Bibi used it. If you look at the speech, he was clearly talking about Hamas. He goes on to be very, very clear, just as Yoav Gallant, when he was giving his speech, was very clear, just as Herzog, when he gave his speech, was very clear. They were all talking about Hamas.
Not the Palestinians.
No, not the Palestinians or Gazans as a whole. You don't need to dig far into just reading the whole speech to know this is nonsense. Therefore, it has to be disingenuous that they've cherry-picked these lines. It can't be a mistake. Even in Herzog's, it's the other clause in the sentence where he goes on to clarify, they just take the bit before the comma. So that's disingenuous. They don't mention Hamas at all. To read that report, you'd think that Israel was just whaling missiles into Gaza for fun, and they weren't fighting a war against an enemy where they'd sustained over 3,000 injuries and
Hamas isn't really
killed.
mentioned, right?
Not at all. No, barely at all.
The thing is, if you have any war and you take out one side of it, you're left with the genocide.
Of course you are.
If you don't mention the enemy, you've got a genocide.
Yeah, you could. It's the anniversary of the Battle of Arnhem today. My regiment's famous battle honour for Operation Market Garden. Take the Germans out, and we're just running through Arnhem, slaughtering people. It's ludicrous, but that's what they've done. And it's funny, but it's not funny because this has serious real world implications.
It's like laugh or cry, isn't it?
There's the halo effect, which is where certain institutions have credibility just because of who they are. So Médecins Sans Frontières and NGOs, that they carry the halo effect, and the UN carries that too. And so what we're getting is journalists reporting on this as if it was just a fair, balanced report that's come to a reasonable conclusion, where actually it's not. It's some anti-Israel activists who've taken a ludicrous perspective on this conflict.
Yeah.
There's even a line in there about how Israel started the war on 7th of October. It's absolutely bizarre. So yeah, I mean, it's a depressing report. But it's also boring. It's just yet more nonsense. Not everything is anti-Semitism, but this is.
Yeah.
It's just an anti-Semitic screed against the world's only Jewish state, and shame on the media who've reported this as if it was something newsworthy, quite frankly.
And it was produced by people with their own history of controversial remarks, shall we say, about Israel, from an organisation that's got a long history of Israelophobia. I mean, the UN has a long, long history stretching back into the Cold War. It was a battleground of the Cold War, where the Soviets tried to advance Israelophobic propaganda, seeing Israel as a representative of the Americans and of the democratic West. And in my other book, Israelophobia, I talk in some detail about how the Soviets invented all the lies that are around today. Israel's genocidal, it's white supremacist, it's like the Nazis. Apartheid, all invented by the Soviets. The apartheid slur was around before Israel was on the West Bank. Before 1967. So
genocide's been chucked around since at least 2014.
Yeah, exactly. And, 1975, I think it was, the famous resolution was passed at the UN that Zionism is racism under the influence of the Soviets, which eventually was repealed in 1991 at the end of the Cold War, but had done a lot of damage since then. The stuff that people parrot on the streets, on the airwaves, in society, much of it was designed by what they called Zionologists, Kremlin. They were actually called Zionologists, Kremlin anti-Semites who took old Tsarist anti-Semitism, protocols of the Elders of Zion and other stuff, and changed the language to make it talk about Zionism, and then transmitted it into the West and around the world via radio, via their Soviet embassies, via disinformation campaigns, via, all sorts of different infiltrations. And people don't realize that the shadow of the Soviet Union still lives on in their heads and is influencing the way that they think and the way that people think about it today.
The Russians are masters at psychological warfare. They understand the West far better than we understand them.
Yeah.
I think
we understand ourselves as well.
Indeed. And, I think we fall into this universality trap where we assume that everyone, at the core, everyone really has the same values.
Yeah.
Everyone's really the same.
Yeah.
They layer on culture and religion and stuff like that, but you strip it away and everyone's really the same.
Yeah.
And I would suggest that is nonsense.
Yeah.
And the Russians think in a very different way than we do.
Yeah.
And you can see that, writ large in Ukraine, how that the brutality with which that war is being prosecuted by Russia. And I've been there recently, and I've seen those missiles coming in firsthand, just absolutely indiscriminate.
I mean, there's a lot to say, isn't there, about how there's an instinct in the West to assume that other people are basically fine.
And if they're not fine, it's because it's not really their own fault. It's it's something else. That's
exactly
they're acting up for it because there's injustice or because there's inequality, and that's why they're setting off bombs at pizza restaurants in Tel Aviv.
Yeah, and there's a couple of dimensions to that. There's the psychological dimension. There's a study that I cite in the book where it describes how people who are brought up within authoritarian regimes, a study of tens of thousands of people across the world, people brought up in authoritarian regimes are more likely to have dark traits. It's called the dark triad, 3 dark traits: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and something else, a lack of human empathy, I suppose. But people in democracies are more likely to have the opposite, a light triad of qualities of humanity, of empathy.
Interesting.
And when those two things come together, when you've got, for example, the dark triad of Hamas, not only are they from an authoritarian society, but they've risen to the top of, or they've joined Hamas, they've become the enforcers. They're obviously basically psychopaths. And they look at us in the West with our surfeit of empathy, and the stage is set for manipulation. And there's a lot of that going on. But also I think there's the Wickhamist fallacy.
Yes.
Are you familiar with the Wickhamist fallacy? Where people of a certain breeding in the Foreign Office assume that in the heart of every tin pot despot overseas, there is a decent bloke waiting to get out. A decent chap who would have gone to Winchester College and who, just got to treat him well and he'll emerge. And that's behind, this sort of stuff is behind our invasion of Iraq and our Libya operation to get rid of Gaddafi.
It's behind Starmer shaking hands with Abu Mazen last week.
Yes.
Mohammed Abbas.
Yeah.
It's like if we just give the Palestinians what they've been asking for, then they'll be happy and everything will be fine. And and Fatah, of course, are just a millimeter down from Hamas in terms of the rhetoric they come out with. Yeah. If you look, if you go to Palestine Media Watch and look at some of the Friday speeches they push out in the mosques, outrageous stuff, absolutely outrageous. It's the old Jew hiding behind a rock and all that. It's exactly the same as Hamas.
Yeah.
And this is the guy that Starmer's shaking hands with as our future partner in peace.
And it was interesting, wasn't it? Because Starmer met the Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, who literally has a PhD in Holocaust revisionism, and continues to, is enjoying his 21st year of his 4-year term in office, still pays money, reward money or incentive money to anybody convicted of a terror attack. Public funds, that there's some question about whether that will continue, but that's been the case for many, many years. The Prime Minister welcomes him to Downing Street, is pictured shaking his hand, and yet the President of Israel, who came pretty much the same week or within a week, gets a very different treatment. He didn't get the shaking hands at Downing Street. He wasn't welcomed to Downing Street. Did the Prime Minister even meet him? I don't think he did.
Yeah, I think there was a picture of them across the table with each other.
Yeah, but it was entirely different.
It's very awkward.
And it's just a complete inversion of the, of values. People have become so blinded to our own finger waving that we've lost sight of the fact that, Israel's flawed. There are errors, whatever. But you've got basically a democracy against jihadism that want to kill us too. It's not. It shouldn't be difficult to decide which side you're on, and yet it is.
And it was on the day that there was that shooting in, I think it was Jerusalem, wasn't it? On the buses. That same day is the day that our Prime Minister thought it appropriate to meet with the figurehead of the ones who'd done the shooting rather than the victims.
Yeah.
It really is this incredible inversion.
And it kind of brings us back to that, to the deep psychology of what's going on in the liberal elites, particularly in the West, when it comes to Israel. You know, and finally, just to wrap it up, just to bring it back to the Tommy Robinson March in Israel and try to get this conversation tied up with a bow. I was thinking when I saw the Robinson March and heard some of the rhetoric coming from the stage, the anti-Islam rhetoric. If I was a Muslim, decent Muslim, patriotic Muslim like Ed Hussein, who I think I could say is my friend. I've met him many times, but I think I could say that. British, maybe with a grandfather who fought in the Second World War. A lot of Muslims fought for Britain in the First World War, Second World War. My grandfather fought at D-Day, the Jewish grandfather, and in fact, the other grandfathers in the RAF as well. You come from a long military history. But if I was a Muslim who was decent and British, and I was there at the rally, I think I would feel scared.
Yeah, you'd feel radicalized, wouldn't you?
I'd feel scared.
It has the complete opposite effect to bringing people together. And that's the real skill here, I think, is to bridge those gaps.
Yeah.
To restore that national pride, that patriotism, but without creating an atmosphere where you're alienating huge chunks of people who might misinterpret your intentions. And that is clearly not helped by having someone on stage who's blasting out pure anti-Islam.
Exactly. And actually, I feel inspired by Israel, to bring it back to Israel, to bring that into the conversation here again, because, after October the 7th, on October the 7th, something like, was it 15 Muslim Israelis were killed by Hamas, something like that?
Yeah, there were a number, certainly. I don't know the exact.
And there was a number of Arab Muslims who helped rescue Jews on October the 7th, who then stood up for Israel after October the 7th. There was Lucia Harish, the famous Muslim TV anchor in Israel, helped personally to oversee a rescue of some Jews on October the 7th, and then go a very, very moving TV monologue saying that, we're all Israeli, let's stand up against this. The same thing was seen in the Knesset when one of the Arab members of Knesset made some remarks doubting the reports of rape or whatever on rape or other abuse on October the 7th. She was immediately sacked by Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Muslim party there in the Knesset. And we saw it with Naz Daily, the YouTuber, Israeli Arab YouTuber, who wrote a column for Haaretz. The headline was something like, "I used to be Palestinian Israeli, now I'm Israeli first." You've got Muslims fighting in the IDF, the Israeli forces, seeing action in Gaza. Captain Ella, the most senior Muslim officer in the IDF, a sort of social media figure, was doing posts, "Long live Israel" and so on. And there's more, of course, there's lots of division, lots of problems in Israel, but there's also more integration of Muslims there in some ways than we have here.
Yeah.
And I remember once being in Israel during the stabbing intifada a few years ago, when there's lots of stabbings going on. And I was there with a colleague from a left-wing newspaper, who I won't name, a friend of mine.
You can tell me afterwards.
I'll tell you afterwards. And we were there by one of the gates into the old city where lots of the stabbings occurred. I think it was the Damascus Gate. And we were interviewing Mickey Rosenfeld, the chief of police, about how the police deal with the threat of stabbings. And he was talking about how they scrutinize every person coming through. And my colleague from the left-wing paper said that we spotted a man who walked past in traditional Muslim robes. And he said, "Well, surely you'd look at him, wouldn't you?" And Mickey Rosenfeld just looked kind of nonplussed. He was like, "No, he's just wearing traditional robes. Like, why him? We look more for like young people who look shifty, who've got a backpack or whatever." And it was interesting to see almost more sort of stereotypical thinking from the Western liberal journalist than from the Israeli police officer. And I feel similar to that. That inspires me a lot, that there's a lot of wisdom that we can take. There's a lot of, there are lessons about how to integrate minorities into your country when you know who you are and when you aren't afraid of flying your flag. Then there's more generosity, there's more space for minorities in your country. And I felt that growing up in a Jewish community, an Orthodox Jewish community when I was a kid, that we knew who we were. We wanted to be left alone to be Jewish and do our thing. Every Saturday, every Shabbat, we recited prayers for the royal family, which were inscribed on the wall of our synagogues. And we wanted, I think we would, I probably speak for the majority of Jews in this country when I say that we would feel more secure in a country that knows that it's Christian than one that has just chucked out all of its own traditions and identity. Because if you can't respect your own traditions and identity, how can you protect ours?
And of course, nature abhors a vortex as well. And these are deep-seated human needs.
A vacuum, yeah.
What did I say? Vortex.
I'm sure it abhors a vortex as well, but
same thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, the point is, if you don't have
Exactly
that,
right,
it's going to be filled with something else. If you don't write your own national story, somebody else will write it for you, and you might not like what they write.
Yeah, and it's the progressive radicals, the Islamist radicals, and the far right. Not so much here, but more certainly in America. It's big and across Europe. I think we've covered some ground.
I think we've taken things to the brink.
Right, so let's talk about the next episode.
So we have an incredible guest next week, very high profile. It's one you won't want to miss. I'm not going to tell you who it is just yet, but trust me, this is one that you're definitely going to want to tune in for.
Absolutely. So make sure you join us next week, same time, same place, Thursday. Next episode's going to drop with that secret guest. Join us once again on The Brink.